Hi, this is Marcy Cockrell. Thank you so much for the conversation. I'll say I'm a biological administrator with the Division of Aquaculture in the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So it was nice to see aquaculture up there on the slides as a kind of a consideration for sustainability and thinking about climate change. My question is about the communications and outreach piece that you both touched on a little bit, and I liked the analogy about triaging, and how do you pick kind of what's worth investing resources in. I'd like to know from both of you, kind of in your your communication and outreach and having to do more of that, kind of what your I guess your main takeaway, kind of your major lesson learned, especially when it comes to interacting with policymakers and thinking about, triaging climate impacts and how you set priorities and get people to buy in, the policymakers, but as well as their constituents. Thinking about how scientists and myself now working as a regulator, what's a lesson that we should take away when we want to and need to communicate with those folks about these kinds of impacts and solutions moving forward.
I can weigh in. I mean, I think a lot of the lessons learned should have been obvious, but painfully so were not. And that's that the first step is listening, right? But I think it's fair to say 15, even 10 years ago, the way that science operated is that we had this loading dock model where we take our science, we put it on a website or we put it out there. We say, all right, you make sense of it and you do with it as you will. And then we're surprised when people don't use it or misrepresent it. But now, again, it's painfully obvious, but you have to start where people are, what their priorities are, what their worldviews are. So, for example, I was in South Carolina for 12 years, and ended up being my closest allies were people in the faith community who looked at caring for creation. They were the U.S. military, looking at the climate change on military preparedness, and impacts of climate change on civil unrest. They were local businesses who were looking at how their bottom line was going to be affected by climate change. They could care less about intertidal mussels. I mean, if I'm going to start going out there and talking to them about the little robots I make, there's a cool factor, but it really doesn't impact their daily lives. And I think, that's, I won't speak for Mark, but we both came to Northeastern as part of this Coastal Sustainability Institute that all of us do use-inspired research. And I think all of us have, in some cases painfully so, learned the lesson that the first step is listening and finding out where your audience is, and then finding out how you change what you're doing to fit what their interests are. And their motivations may be totally different than yours, but at least in my experience, that's the only way to make it work. I mean, Mark, what do you think?
Yes, I mean, I think both of us have come to the realization that, and maybe this will help answer how you interact with different groups, Marcy, is the power of story, because we're a storytelling species, is completely overlooked at both the outreach and the policy level stage. And it was very interesting just watching the 7 hot hours of presentations by the Democratic candidates for president that just occurred. Was most of them recognized that until climate change is made personal and stories are told, it's hard to connect with people. And so I thought a lot of them did a good job of weaving in. Usually it was one of the people asking a question, the story that how changes are going to directly affect them. Similar thing in the children's lawsuit that's trying to stop fossil fuel subsidies nationally in the U.S. based on the Equal Protection Clause under the Constitution. The brief for that lawsuit's really great primer on all the evidence for climate change that's been around and been very strong since about 1989. But the lawsuit actually started off with a story for each one of the plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs were kids in their early teens when this lawsuit started. And so I've recognized when I go out and do communication, even when I'm doing graduate level communication to people who are doing a PhD, that using story to reach people to make a point that will later touch on policy or even the underlying science is a highly effective method, but it takes training to do well. A colleague of ours, a friend of ours, Randy Olson, has spent a career trying to teach scientists how to tell effective stories when they're involved in the policy arena.
Yep.
So I don't know if that answers your question about triage and how we decide what's most important. That's something usually scientists don't make a judgment call on. It's usually more, as Brian said, trying to give you facts. When you're interested in X, okay, here's what you need to know about Y that affects impact X that you're asking me about.
I mean, I think it does touch on the triage, right? Because again, if you're only presenting it from the ecological viewpoint, and that is not the top priority of the person you're communicating with, you're going to get pushback.
Yes.
So, there are multiple components of this, including economic, societal, ethical, you name it. So.
Yeah, that does answer my question. Thank you so much. And it's definitely advice in line with other communications training I've had before. So thank you so much.
Sure.
You're welcome.
Great. Why don't I ask a question here for Vaithi. Vaithi is a assistant professor of physics at Westfield State University. Okay. And Vaithi has two questions. I'll read the first one. And if anyone else wants to enter a question in chat or chime in, everyone except Lisa is unmuted. Lisa may be in a loud environment, so she wants that muted. The question here is, do climate experts really think that we still have a chance of keeping global temp increase to 1.5 C? The IPCC report claims this is still possible. It seems to me that this claim is a fantasy driven by political considerations rather than science. Is it still feasible to keep warming to 2C, 3C?
So back to Mark's point about storytelling. I am an avid Red Sox fan. And in order to make the playoffs, they have a very narrow path. If anybody's an Avengers fan, there's like this 1 in 14 million chance for them to succeed. Alex Cora got interviewed the other night about the Red Sox chance, and he referenced the movie Dumb and Dumber, which I actually haven't seen, but I gather they had about an 8% chance to save the world or something like that. And that's where he's at with the Red Sox right now. To be totally honest, I have a feeling that's where we're at with 1.5. Is it physically feasible and possible? Sure. I mean, I think, I wouldn't lecture a physics professor. I'm sure he knows better than I do. My understanding is that, yeah, if we shut off all the greenhouse gas right now, there's still inertia in the system. We're still going to have warming of at least another ½ degree. Is it possible? Now, in the age of Trump and post-fact communication, is this possible? I'd say we're probably in Avengers territory with that. I think we still need to discuss mitigation and reductions of greenhouse gases to slow the train. And I think because of the nonlinear way that greenhouse gas increase translates into temperature increase and climate increase, the more we can reduce greenhouse gases, the less the impact will be. But I think we have to be talking about mitigation, because I think we'll be very, very lucky if we keep it to 1.5. I don't know, Mark, do you agree?
Yeah, and I'm also extremely worried about the runaway methane that we're releasing with the Arctic warming, as well as potential release from continental shelf methane ice, methane hydrates. Yeah. Methane's got an order of magnitude more heat retention capability can be used by microbes, so it doesn't last nearly as long in the atmosphere as CO2 does. I'm actually of the opinion that if we want to save coral reefs for the next couple of generations, that we actually that we need to move beyond the what are we going to do about taxing carbon, et cetera, to actually trying to build a machine to extract CO2 out of the Earth's atmosphere. And it's going to have to scale and scale fast if we're going to have a hope of saving coral reef ecosystems. I think that probably won't happen given the $1 trillion plus price tag it might take, but it's not out of the question that technology hasn't been scaled yet, but enough R&D has been done, including some great work at Harvard, that we could potentially build a machine to actually draw down CO2, not just slow the rate of accumulation. I'm not supportive of the bioengineering schemes of fertilizing the ocean or sending rockets into the stratosphere to create dust clouds, because I think we don't understand enough about the feedbacks there for any of that to be tenable. But we do know how to chemically extract CO2 out of the Earth's atmosphere, and we'd have to get a lot of it out, many tons, and store it somewhere. But that's a soluble problem with our current understanding. It's just going to be extremely expensive. On the subject of where we might end up on this chat question from the assistant professor of physics, our science communicator friend Randy Olson had a correspondence before he died with the great science fiction author, whatever you want to call him, former doctor Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park. Interestingly, Crichton, one of the last books he published was a climate denial book, a novel called State of Fear.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my time debunking that because a lot of it took place in South Carolina.
Yeah, so it used a lot of the techniques that were used in the misinformation campaign over the last 3 decades to make us think that humans don't have anything to do with it. But Crichton did carry on a correspondence with Randy, who was a storyteller and was trying to get Crichton's take. And Crichton said something very telling, that he had an exchange with Al Gore, our former vice president, about the state of the climate. And Vice President Gore and it truly is, in my mind, a planetary emergency that we're under. It really is an existential threat. All the Democratic candidates are saying that in the debates. And the retort from Crichton was, well, if it really is such an existential threat, climate emergency, why are we not going to like a World War II footing overnight where the lights are off and we have blackouts and air travel's, almost completely eliminated, blah, blah, blah. And I have to admit that the inertia of just trying to, carry on business as usual with our comfortable lifestyles in the developed world is just so huge that the Crichton does have a point. That like the old comic from the first Earth Day, Pogo said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us," or she is us. So yeah, I'm a little bit, I'm sorry, I'm massively pessimistic about limiting to 1.5. Sorry to agree with you there, buddy.
I am too, but I think one important point as to whether it's political or not. I think the analogy is, if we found out that all the food we've been eating was laden with lead, is it likely that we're not going to have impacts in the future because of all the lead we've been eating? No. Do we have to find some way of getting rid of the lead out of our bodies, like you're saying with CO2? Yes. How stupid would we be to keep eating the same food that has the same lead? And, really that's the same thing we're talking about with CO2. Is it going to fix the problem? No. Are we still going to have major climate change Yes. But how stupid are we to keep still eating poison now that it's crystal clear that it's happening and that we're eating it? So, yeah, I mean, 1.5 may be unrealistic, but I think it's stupid for us not to try.
Yeah. Thanks.
Great. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule.
Oh, sure. It was our pleasure.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Okay.
Thank you for watching the Future Frogmen Conversation Series. Please check out our website at www.futurefrogmen.org.